Welcome. My name is Susan Cook, and I'm the programs librarian here at the Rancho Mirage Library. We are very pleased to present today's lecture. If you build it, they will come. And I think Melissa built a lecture, and you came. And this is part of Modernism Week. Melissa is a writer, researcher, and historian. She has written about architecture, preservation, and design for 20 years. Her articles have appeared in Atomic Ranch magazine and the Desert Sun newspaper, as well as other resources. Her book, Mod Mirage, is to be published in the fall by Gibbs Smith, and will focus on Rancho Mirage Riche and rich architectural, as well as discuss its influential social history. Melissa, please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So Susan just asked the question that I was going to ask, which is how many of you from out of town, but how many of you from Rancho Mirage? Okay, so it's kind of equal. I like to know who I'm talking to, obviously, so I will bear in mind that actually a larger percentage of you don't know anything about the city. Just before I get started, as you can tell, I have an English accent. And you might wonder why I chose to write about Rancho Mirage. It's because I bought a house here a few years ago. And the reason I bought a house here a few years ago was because I read about Sunnyland's opening. And I thought, well, if it's good enough for the Annenbergs, maybe it's good enough for me. So I've really enjoyed living in Rancho Mirage. Confusingly, I'm currently living in Dallas, but that's only going to be for another year. And as Susan mentioned, my book, Mod Mirage, is going to be coming out in the fall, and I hope all of you will buy it. So without further ado, I'm going to go through this presentation and explain why I wrote the book. This is kind of the introduction to the book, in fact. As I was writing the book and doing all the research into the architecture in Rancho Mirage and the communities, I live in a historic mid-century community called Tamarisk Ranchos, and many of my neighbors are here today. I started to realize that this city of Rancho Mirage has a very unique aspect to it, which is unlike a lot of cities that grow up around some form of trade, whether it's gold in San Francisco or cattle in Fort Worth or a port in Los Angeles or whatever it might be. Here, the reason for Rancho Mirage growing was actually the creation of a couple of country clubs. And it's pretty amazing to realize how much the city has grown. What was here first when before Rancho Mirage was developed was this barren desert. And the story of the book that I've written and today's lecture is really about if you build it, they will come, because creating something out of barren desert isn't something that's obvious to everybody. When the first people started building homes here, this is really what the desert looked like. There were some ranches and some agriculture, and you can see the kind of Highway 111 going through the bottom left-hand corner of this picture, and also the wash going through the middle. The very first subdivision in the city was created in the 30s, and they had lots of fantastic dreams for this subdivision. It was called Rancho Mirage, as you can see, and its main selling point, that it was 15 minutes from Palm Springs, was also promoted as being somewhere that you could arrive by camel, apparently. The people who created it wanted to create something that replicated the Nile, and so they called the road Sahara Road, and the dream was apparently to have people visit by camel. That didn't work out. World War II came along, and pretty much that plan fell by the wayside. Having said that, several people did build houses here, and they built adobe-style houses. And Frank Morgan, who some of you may know as the Wizard of Oz, was one of the very first people to build a house in that particular area called Rancho Mirage. That area that was known as Rancho Mirage back then is now Magnesia Falls Cove, which is the area of houses that's opposite the river, the shopping center. So if you ever want to drive up there and discover a bit more about the city's history, that's a good place to start. And Frank Morgan's house is still there. So after the war, a guy by the name of Ronald Button appeared, and he bought several hundred acres around that subdivision, all the way up into Magnesia Falls Cove, in fact. And he started selling lots there for people to build houses on, and he built quite a few houses himself. He eventually went into partnership with Art Linkletter, who some of you may remember. He was a TV and radio star who was also very enterprising, and he was very good friends with Ronald Button, and they decided to invest in building several hundred homes, and again, those homes are mostly still up in Magnesia Falls Cove. They joined forces with a couple of real estate people, and they created this rather wonderful stone entry to their subdivision with the name Rancho Mirage still. And it was promoted as being Palm Springs' favorite suburb. Bear in mind, it was 15 minutes away from Palm Springs. And it was a planned community of your dreams, 8 miles southeast of Palm Springs. One of the other things that happened at the same time was the creation of a couple of guest ranches and hotels. And this was the Desert Air Park that was famous for having fly-in, fly-out capabilities with a runway, as you can see, next to the hotel. And this was started in about 1948 as well. So 1948, post-war, a bit like Palm Springs, is when things started to take off in this area. But this was still very much around the area that was known as Rancho Mirage, up near Magnesia Falls Cove. If anyone's ever been to the Omni Rancho Las Palmas Hotel, as you're sitting outside on the patio having your lunch, if you look up a certain direction, essentially what you're looking at is the landing strip for the Desert Air Park Hotel, and that's where Omni Rancho Las Palmas is today. And that's just another picture of Desert Air Hotel. Why is Rocky Road ice cream suddenly here? Well, this is how Thunderbird got started. Thunderbird Ranch was the forerunner of Thunderbird Country Club, and the first person to invest his money into Thunderbird Ranch was Mr. Eady, who had made his money by joining forces with Mr. Dreyer and creating Rocky Road ice cream. So he invested money into several hundred acres of land and hired Frank Bogert, who also invested his money, to create a ranch that would be a guest ranch with accommodations and would bring in all the people who loved to go horseback riding. And in the late 40s, horseback riding around the Palm Springs area was really one of the main reasons that people came to the city. The outdoor aspect of being in the desert is obviously still attractive today, but horse riding and horseback trails through the mountains were very much the reason that people came here for weekends, for chuck wagon breakfasts and just dressing up in Western gear. There was a lot of that going on. So this was an early ad I found for Thunderbird Ranch, and there you can see the original guest quarters around a swimming pool in the middle. And the roads that you can see highlighted in the top right-hand corner are what's now Thunderbird Heights. And what's intriguing about this, and here's another picture of it as it was back in the 40s, all the buildings there were very Western style and very comfortable, but nothing very fancy about them. But what was intriguing to me about them was that they were designed by a very, very famous architect called Gordon Kaufman. And Gordon Kaufman was best known during the war, before the war and after the war, for designing the Hoover Dam. Amongst other things, he also designed the Cooley Dam. He designed the LA Times building in downtown LA, and he was known for these huge kind of civil projects around the US. So it was kind of weird to me that he designed those buildings and also designed the dam. It's like, okay, how does that work? So Johnny Dawson, if ever there should be a statue of anybody in Rancho Mirage, it should really be Johnny Dawson. I don't think any of us would be here today, not for the same reasons, if it wasn't for this man. How many of you are golfers? Yes, quite a few. So certainly the golfers among you know who Johnny Dawson was. He was a famous amateur golfer, and he played regularly at the O'Donnell course in Palm Springs. There was a big annual invitational tournament, and there he would play with people like Bing Crosby and Bob Hope. And he was also an entrepreneur, and by the late 40s, he was heavily involved in real estate. And he kept thinking every time he was at the O'Donnell course, which is a 9-hole course, that what the valley really needed was an 18-hole golf course. So he started doing his due diligence and looking around for the best site. And he hit on Thunderbird Ranch because he knew there was water, and he knew that he would need a lot of water to irrigate the greens and the fairways. And he went on to become a very successful man. He ended up building El Dorado Country Club and Marrakesh and many others. And this was the group that he put together to start Thunderbird. Having done all his due diligence for Thunderbird, he took something like 9 months to take it to fruition. And the most intriguing thing about his idea was that with Barney HINKLE, who's on the far right, they dreamed up this idea of building homes on fairways. And this had never really been done before. It had been done sort of here and there, but it hadn't been a plan to actually develop a fairway with homes around the golf course. And the idea of doing this was to sell off the home sites in order to pay for the construction of the club. And it was a pretty amazing idea, and it was really, talk about if you build it, they will come. I mean, he really did have a dream, and a lot of people thought he was crazy. Ben Hogan and a Texan called Pollard Simons, who'd partnered with Hogan, he was a developer, came into the valley about the same time, and they thought about building a golf course. And Ben Hogan said, "You're out of your mind, you can't build a golf course in the desert." And they split, went back to Dallas. And I'll come back to that later on. So, actually, just go back to that one. Frank Bogert, if you don't know who he is, he's the tall guy in the back. And he was kept on to manage Thunderbird Country Club, having lost $50,000 a year on the Thunderbird Ranch program. And he needed a job, I guess, needed to get his money back. So he saw that there was an opportunity here to get involved in Thunderbird. On the far left is William F. Cody, who became responsible initially for changing all those lovely old Gordon Kaufman Western-style buildings into something that was suitable for a golf club. So here in the early 50s, you're starting to see a bit more going on. In the bottom right-hand corner, you can actually see Thunderbird Country Club. And the kind of bare earth in the middle of that kind of triangle is actually mostly Fairway Drive on Thunderbird. And that's where they were creating home sites, also over to the left-hand side. To the right, in the center, is where some of the houses from the original part of Rancho Mirage were built. But you can still see that there's a lot of desert around here and a lot of date palm groves. So this is kind of the plan that they hatched, and I want to thank Scott Julian at Thunderbird Country Club for letting me dive through his archives. This was in amongst some of the treasures that they have over at Thunderbird. And this was a kind of early plan, an early site plan, that shows you the houses on Fairway Drive in the left-hand corner that I was just talking about. and also shows you the lot plan for Thunderbird Heights up above. And at this point, the original Kaufman buildings are still gathered around the pool on the right-hand side. One of the first people to invest in Thunderbird was Bing Crosby. Really, the reason for the success of Thunderbird was, the initial success was because so many celebrities were golfing mad. And Bing Crosby and Bob Hope among them were investors, and so was Phil Harris, Desi Arnaz and Lucille Ball, and many of them. And they all started building houses. They invested in the club, and that gave them the rights to buy a lot for $5,000. Bing Crosby actually was the first one to decide to build up in Thunderbird Heights. And this was a very simple home. We don't know who the designer was, although we're trying to figure that one out. It's still there, although it's very much remodeled. Bing and Bob. For all the architecture fans among you, this was something that kind of appealed to me. One of the first people to design homes on Thunderbird was actually Cliff May. And if you are an architecture fan, that's quite a big deal, because he was really the man who created what we think of as the California Western ranch-style home with the floor-to-ceiling windows. And William F. Cody, who's known to many of you, worked for him for many years. And I was intrigued to see that they actually built a Cliff May model home. It says here on Thunderbird, but in fact, I think it was up in Thunderbird Heights, and I've seen other ads talking about that. And this was the kind of home that he was designing for use out here. So what then happened is the celebrities started building their homes around Thunderbird. Phil Harris and Alice Faye were very famous at the time. He was a band leader and a comedian. She was an actress. And they were building quite simple Western-style ranch homes. I don't know if this is a Cliff May, it might be, but that's the kind of home that really started out on Thunderbird. Those were the first style. It's Phil and Alice. And then William Cody had to redesign the main buildings at Thunderbird. They weren't really suitable for golf, and they needed a clubhouse. So he designed a clubhouse which had a sunken bar, and so people could sit at the bar and look over the bartender's head and see the activity on the putting green and the first tee in front of them. And that really became the social hotspot for Thunderbird, and was the reason that Thunderbird became the main reason that Thunderbird became so successful. The other reason Thunderbird became very successful was because they introduced electric golf carts. And the golf cart was in existence, but they were sort of frowned on. And a couple of people apparently claimed to have some sort of disability and said, can we use an electric cart? And the next thing you know, they just kind of took off, and obviously the celebrities couldn't be refused. So if Bing Crosby showed up and wanted to ride on an electric golf cart, they weren't going to stop him. Thunderbird also featured 14 cottages that were designed by Cody, and those are still there. They're long gable style, and they were available for rent to Thunderbird members. And then, as I mentioned, Thunderbird Heights was, they were trying hard to get people to build on Thunderbird Heights, but it took really a long time to take off. And as you know, now it's a very exclusive place to live, and it became more so, but it took a few years. Lucy and Desi really were some of the first celebrities to build their home. Their house was built in 1954. The house is still there, again, remodeled. And they chose Paul R. Williams, who was a famous African-American architect working in Los Angeles. And he's being honored at Modernism Week this week. So if you're interested, they're putting a star on the Walk of Fame in his honor outside the Architecture and Design Center. This is a beautiful picture of the house that he designed for them, and it was very much admired. One of the houses that I particularly love that's still there on Thunderbird is this one. It was really one of the earliest houses. Stewart Williams is a very famous architect. His designs are all around Palm Springs. He became known for his banks. The Architecture and Design Center today used to be a bank. And his the Chase Bank is also one of his structures. But of the many residences that he designed, this was one of the very early ones at Thunderbird, 1952. Mostly they were building the kind of Western-style ranch. This house was particularly intriguing because it had an indoor-outdoor swimming pool. And I read an article in the Desert Sun that said that golfers kept on trying to hit their balls close to the house so that they could check out the pool. And the pool is still there, at least Google Earth says it is, and I believe it. This is the house that I think, from an architectural point of view, is one of the most interesting on Thunderbird. Cody, as I mentioned, had been working with Cliff May and mostly designing the Western-style ranch. But the Jorgensen family, Earl Jorgensen was known for being the creator of Jorgensen Steel, asked Cody to design them this house on Thunderbird. It's in a very fabulous position, overlooking the fairways, kind of a little bit raised up. And they kind of gave Cody free rein to design the house, and he designed these huge overhangs that you can see that became really the signature for modernist houses built on the fairways. One of the reasons Johnny Dawson decided to create Thunderbird where he did was because being further east, down valley, you're away from the impact of Mount San Jacinto, which, as you know, if you spend time in Palm Springs, kind of cuts off your sunshine at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon in the winter. But in Rancho Mirage, one of the reasons we love it here is because we get a bit more sun. But they also, architects then had to design around that. So especially if you had a house that faced south and west, you needed to have these deep overhangs to really take care of the solar gain that you were getting from the extra sun. So that's the way it used to look. This is the way it looks today. You can see it looks almost exactly the same. And what happened after the Jorgensens had the house built was that Mrs. Jorgensen decided she didn't like it. And the Mavis family, who were members of the club, said, "We'll buy it from you." And the house is still owned by the Mavis family, who've kept it in absolutely pristine, original condition. And it's really the most beautiful house. I'm very happy to have included it in the book. The next thing that happened that made such a difference to the fame and notoriety of Thunderbird, and to some extent Tamarisk, was the Ryder Cup. Jimmy Hines became the first golf pro at Thunderbird, and he was able to secure the Ryder Cup in 1955. And at this time, golf was starting to be televised nationally. And that really made a big difference to everybody as well, because anytime they could see something different happening in the golf world, they were interested to watch. And it really impacted the way people felt about living on a golf course too, because the Ryder Cup program, and these pictures are taken from that, clearly showed some of the beautiful houses that were being built along the fairways. This is a really amazing house that was built in the mid-50s at Thunderbird. The house has been completely remodeled, but it was built for Robert McCulloch. Robert McCulloch was an entrepreneur, and he had an amazing talent for just about anything he put his mind to. So he had an engineering company that created motors for pretty much everything in America. So whether it was a chainsaw or a powerboat, his motors were basically driving America. And he created this amazing push-button house. that was featured on the front of Life magazine in 1956. And this, believe it or not, is a rotating sun lounger. And I don't know how the dog felt about it, but fortunately it was a white dog, not a black dog. But the girls I later discovered were all seniors at Palm Springs High School. The house took about 2 years to build, and most of that was actually building the slab because McCulloch decided to make everything push-button. And in order to do that, a lot of elevator mechanisms had to be sunk into the slab. And he had things like push-button beds that rose up so you could make the beds. He had push-button bars so that when the whiskey bottles were empty, a new one would pop up out of the bar. And it was really the most amazing house and very, very famous. People still ask me to this day, where's the push-button house? And it is on Thunderbird, but it really, unfortunately, is, well, it's been modernized to take care of 21st century gadgets rather than mid-1950s gadgets. Okay. Leonard Firestone was also a famous industrialist. He was the head of Firestone Tires. And so like McCulloch and like Jorgensen, he was one of the many rich people that came to the clubs and decided to build a big house. And he bought several lots in Thunderbird. He was also one of the early sponsors. He sponsored a lot of the palm trees on the golf course. And he built this beautiful house by Pereira, who was known for buildings in Los Angeles like the, gosh, my mind's gone blank. Sorry. I'm thinking about Beckett, too, who built the McCulloch House. Beckett, actually, just going back to that one, he was actually known for building the Capitol Records building and the Cinerama Dome and the Music Center in downtown LA, and pretty much any significant building in Los Angeles was by Welton Beckett, who designed that house. Pereira had designed a lot of department stores for Robinsons and later designed the Robinsons building in Palm Springs that's now a BevMo. It has been restored, though. It's a very beautiful building. So it's right opposite the Architecture and Design Center. If you get a chance to look at it, he was the man. That's Leonard Firestone on the left, and on the right you've got Eisenhower. In the middle, that's Dolores Hope, Bob Hope's wife. And the reason for this slide is really to show you how people who owned houses at Thunderbird and Tamarisk really mingled with everybody. So it became this oasis of influence in the desert between politicians and presidents who came out here and people of influence like Leonard Firestone, who eventually became ambassador to Belgium. And Firestone was actually quite heavily involved in getting Eisenhower to come out to visit the desert in 1954. So I'm going to switch to Tamarisk. Tamarisk really started in a very different way from Thunderbird. The people who started Tamarisk were essentially the Marx Brothers and a guy called Joe Blumenfeld, who owned the Wonder Palms Guest Ranch, and a guy called Lou Halper, who was a developer in Los Angeles. And what they all had in common, or mostly had in common, was that they were members of the Hillcrest Country Club. And Hillcrest Country Club had been started in the 20s, I think I'm right in saying, by a lot of immigrant Jews from Europe who were starting up the film business. And Hillcrest became known for its membership being nearly all entertainment industry, but being Jewish entertainment industry. And that's why the Marx Brothers were members, and that's why so many people that got involved in Tamarisk in the beginning were members of Hillcrest. So Joe Blumenfeld, who owned this ranch, got together with the Marx Brothers, and they hatched out a plan to develop a kind of Hillcrest desert country club where all their friends their entertainment friends from Los Angeles would be welcome. And the first person to really get this going was Lou Halper. Here he's seen playing golf in his very fancy shorts. And as you can see, Tamarisk was a bit barren back in the day, but they soon changed that. And this was the groundbreaking for the clubhouse at Tamarisk. So in the first year of Tamarisk, they actually used the Wonder Palms guest ranch for the clubhouse facilities. And that remained the case until they built the clubhouse that Cody designed, the first clubhouse at Tamarisk. And here you have Harpo Marx, who was an avid golfer. He's in the middle of this picture with the spade, kind of fooling around, as you'd expect. And William Cody, second from right, was there looking a bit perplexed by the whole thing. And like Thunderbird, one of the reasons that they could create Tamarisk was obviously it had access to all that lovely water that we still enjoy in our huge, great big aquifer. This is a pretty astonishing fact, is that this lake was the only one of its kind in the Southern California area, i.e. on a golf course. Apparently that hadn't happened before. And the water in the lake was supplied by the underground wells, not surprisingly. But it also says that an astounding 1.25 million gallons of water are required daily to irrigate the Tamarisk grounds. And I still find that figure really difficult to wrap my head around. So here's, like we had with Thunderbird, here's a lot plan for Tamarisk, and thanks to the folks at Tamarisk Country Club who had a copy of this. All of these lots are still there today with houses on them, naturally, with one exception, and that is a row on the far right, which kind of backs on to the Annenberg estate, and those lots were never developed. It's actually still bare desert along there. But you can see that there were lots built in the middle of the fairways like they did at Thunderbird, and also bordering streets as well. I found this postcard just the other day, and I think it's another reminder, as if we needed one, that there really wasn't very much here in the 50s when they created these two clubs. So here's Tamarisk Country Club, surrounded by desert. On the left of the picture, you've got a lot of date palm groves. And on the right, you can see that's now Frank Sinatra Drive, that's kind of running through the middle from the bottom up to the top. You can actually see Frank Sinatra's complex. It's the first, let me see if I can point this out to you. This. That was the first house that was there. And as you can see, there still weren't many houses being built around it, although Zeppo Marx's house was that one there. And the other reason I can date this picture is because that's Harpo Marx's ranch there. He didn't build on the course. He decided to buy several acres and build a house designed by Wallace Neff, who some of you may know because he's famous in LA for his more traditional Spanish-style houses. And then the other things that are interesting to me here, this is the Wonder Palms guest ranch down here. This area here, I know there's some people here from Tamarisk West. This is now Tamarisk West. And I know there's some people here from Duval Estates, and this is now Duval Estates. Tamarisk Gardens is essentially right there. So all these communities that got built subsequently were in the middle of date palm groves. I live up there, and that's Tamarisk Ranchos, and I can actually see a couple of roofs there, so I think that this was the very early days, so about 1957, this picture. So Frank Sinatra came to Tamarisk, and he actually came here earlier than most people think. He came here in about 1954. He sold his house in Palm Springs after he and Ava Gardner finally divorced and stopped throwing things to each other. And he came to Tamarisk, and everyone always said, oh, it's because he wanted to get away from the activity in downtown Palm Springs. that may be the case, but I have also read in an article in Newsweek that he was very anti-Semitism. And some of you will remember that he was very good friends with Sammy Davis Jr. And Sammy Davis Jr. had a big accident and lost one of his eyes, and he recuperated at Frank's house on Tamarisk shortly after Frank bought the house. And I don't know that that would have been allowed before, so that was a big deal to him. He really wanted to embrace all religions, all races, and so that's one of the reasons I believe that he bought at Tamarisk. And as you know, he ended up there for about 40 years. The curious thing is, in about 1957, he put the house on the market. It was a Cody-designed house. It had belonged to somebody else before he bought it. It was a very modest house that he had extended by Cody. And in 1957, he decided that he was going to advertise it. It may have been a favor to the real estate guy, just to give him some extra publicity. But I think it's funny to note that the house was being sold with furniture, including records and books, for $85,000. As you know, it's now a huge compound. I could give you a whole other presentation about Sinatra at Tamarisk, but I have written an article for the Desert Sun about it that you can find online. This I can date too, because in the right-hand side, oops, wrong button. The right-hand side, you've got the helipad that he created when he thought John F. Kennedy was going to come and stay with him. And on the left, you've also got the buildings that were created for the security guards for Kennedy. And as you may know, Kennedy ended up not staying there. He had stayed there before, but he ended up, this particular time, not staying there because the security people and the FBI said they didn't like Sinatra's mob connections, and it caused a huge furore at the time between Sinatra and his brother-in-law, Peter Lawford, who was Kennedy's brother-in-law. That was Zeppo Marx's house. And some of you may be aware that Zeppo Marx's wife, Barbara, became Mrs. Frank Sinatra. So as you can see, they didn't have far to go. So, because this is more about architecture than salacious celebrity gossip, I'm going to flip back to architecture. This is a really delightful house. This is a picture of it from soon after it was built. And this was by Wexler and Harrison. This was on Tamarisk Country Club. And the house is still there, and I'm happy to say it was bought a couple of years ago by a very famous New York architect who's regularly featured in Architectural Digest, and his partner, who's an interior designer, and it now looks like this. And it's featured in my book too. But this house is an absolute gem, and it was essentially a teardown. When they found it, people were looking at it and going, no, there's no way that we can possibly make that happen. We're going to demolish it. One of the other beautiful houses at Tamarisk was the Maslin House, and again, the architecture fans amongst you will be familiar with the Kaufman House in Palm Springs. This was one of the other famous Neutra houses in the area, and this was built on Tamarisk for the Maslins, who were major art collectors. And again, you have this quintessential desert modernism with the vertical and horizontal planes, the deep overhangs, the narrow support structures. And this house, of course, had amazing views over the fairways and to the mountains. And we'll come back to that. So celebrities lined up to play at Tamarisk as well. And here you have actors Mervyn LeRoy and Tony Curtis with Sinatra's best buddies, Al Hart and Dr. Crone. I happen to know that there's a couple in the audience who live in Al Hart's house, so this is for their benefit, Melinda and Bob. Al Hart was Sinatra's banker, and some of you know the story about how Sinatra's son was kidnapped. And Al Hart was actually a bit of a Chicago mobster in his own right. He was a man who the FBI was after from the Prohibition onwards. But he founded City National Bank, and he had obviously access to lots of cash whenever needed. And when Sinatra's son was kidnapped, he called up his buddy Al, who lived down the road, and said, "Oi, Al, can you get on down to the bank and get me 240 grand?" So Al obliged, and they were good buddies forever, I think. Dr. Crone was also lived in our community. And he was known for being Marilyn Monroe's gynecologist. And I believe Ava Gardner's. And there's a very salacious book written by Sinatra's chauffeur that gives all sorts of juicy gossip about what Dr. Crone was up to. So members of Thunderbird also played at Tamarisk, and this is kind of curious because Ben Hogan, who had decided that having a golf course in the desert was a complete waste of time and a bad idea, actually became the first pro at Tamarisk. He didn't stay there very long because it was actually a very successful point in his life, and I think he was lured by other adventures. But here you see him with his mate Pollard Simons and Leonard Firestone and Randolph Scott, who was one of the investors in Thunderbird. Harpo. Harpo loved playing golf, and he loved politics, and he loved fundraising, and he moved his whole family out to his estate opposite Tamarisk and never looked back, and sadly didn't get to enjoy it for as many years as he hoped, but his spirit lives on, I feel. And Dino was seen here playing with Sinatra's neighbor, Mr. Lipsey. So then Eisenhower came out here in 1954, and as I mentioned, Leonard Firestone was quite instrumental in getting him to come out here. And you maybe can see in the middle of this that it says Ike gets in 5 days of golf. And this was really a big deal. It was why he came out here. He came out here to play golf. And after that, there was really no turning back. Here he's seen playing at Tamarisk, but he also played at Thunderbird. And of course, the media coverage of his visit here was just huge, as was, as I mentioned earlier, the Ryder Cup. And as you may know, he ended up buying a house at El Dorado Country Club in Indian Wells. So Bing, we've already talked about it a little bit. Bing was the first person to really understand that there was something else going on in and around Thunderbird and Tamarisk that he could take advantage of. Again, very business-minded. He decided to buy some land opposite kind of sort of Thunderbird Heights, Blue Skies Village, which is still there to this day. And his idea was to create a trailer village. He got William F. Cody to master plan the whole site, which had 200 plus trailers on it, and also design the ramadas, and also design the clubhouse, which you can see in the background here. And it became incredibly successful. I had an amazing opening party with people like Phil Harris flipping pancakes, and Jack Benny, Lauren Bacall, people like that. So it was a very, very successful project, and it's still there today. And if you drive up to the gate, you'll see Bing Crosby's profile in blue with a pipe sticking out of his mouth. And it's very much loved, and I think it's the most wonderful place. I mean, trailer villages don't get very good press these days, but I actually think it's a really beautiful place to live. I particularly love this ad because this kind of says it all to me. Dunes today, dollars tomorrow. And that's, that's what happened. Once Thunderbird and Tamarisk were established, people realized, like Bing Crosby, that not everybody could afford to live in or build a house on the golf course. They were people who wanted to play golf, but they didn't want to make a major investment either into the maintenance or just building a big house. So people like Bud Morris decided to start building huge tracts of land, especially around Tamarisk, and clearing out the date palms. And you can see Bud Morris in the top left-hand corner, just about make him out, standing amongst all the date palm groves. And I came across one mention of one of the communities that he was responsible for, where they were emptying out the date palms and selling off 80 mature date palms. But dunes today, dollars tomorrow. I could have called this talk "Dunes Today, Dollars Tomorrow" because it was kind of, that's the way it was. So this is an interesting picture I just got hold of a couple of days ago. Pollard Simons, who had been Ben Hogan's business partner and the one who thought about creating a Thunderbird out here, had ended up buying a 40-acre ranch. And he also was one of the first donors of 25 acres of land to the Eisenhower Medical Center. Although Bob Hope gets all the credit for that, Pollard Simons, who you see on the right, and his wife Sharon on the left, who still lives here in Rancho Mirage, were actually the people who kind of kick-started the Eisenhower Medical Center. And they were very good friends with Eisenhower, and they went to live in El Dorado after he built Thunderbird North. I don't know, was anyone here able to visit Thunderbird North yesterday? It was open for Modernism Week. Terrific. Thank you for coming. This house was Pollard Simon's house, and this was Monty Moncrief's house. Moncrief was the Texas oil man too. The house here was Jimmy Hines' house. He was the first golf pro for Thunderbird. And then this one belonged to a friend of theirs called Chuck Needham. This one belonged to Eddie Lowry. For the golf fans in the room, you might know who he was. And this was a community of 10 houses gathered around a central pool. Unlike all the resort-style communities that followed after this particular community, all the houses were custom built. And for anyone who ever gets a chance to go to Thunderbird North, there are no signs outside it. It's on the corner of Morningside Drive and Country Club Drive. Not all of them are mid-century. There's 3 or 4 that aren't. But there are several Cody houses, several Wexler and Harrison houses, and it's, to my mind, one of the most historic communities here. They were all mad keen golfers, and they all belonged to Thunderbird, but they just wanted to have their own separate estate opposite Thunderbird, with their own pitch and putt course in the middle. They even had a sand trap that you can see right there. And then this huge, great big pool that's smaller now. But essentially, it's much the same as it was. And Cody master planned the whole community. So now we started talking about communities. This is really what we started with Bing Crosby and Blue Skies, and we've moved on to Thunderbird North. But this was really, to my mind, the next most historic community. It was built between Thunderbird and Tamarisk, and it was built as cooperative apartments. And these were sold really very cheaply. In fact, I discovered that in downtown Palm Springs, they had a special exhibit for about 2 months called Bramerama. And they had all sorts of show apartments and show designs on display during that. And this was designed by an architect called John Lindsay. And John Lindsay was actually a very early partner with Palmer and Krisel. William Krisel might be known to many of you for designing homes around Palm Springs, and he designed a lot of hundreds of thousands of homes, I think, or tens of thousands of homes across Southern California. John Lindsay was a bit of a rogue, and when he wasn't designing buildings, he was advertising whiskey and cigarettes. And not many people know much about him. I think he designed some very cool buildings in LA, but Desert Braemar was his only design out here. And Desert Braemar is really original, actually. I really encourage you to visit if you ever get a chance. He ended up married to June Lockhart. So he had a really interesting life outside of being an architect. And this was Desert Braemar in all its glory, just after it opened, with the horses by the swimming pool. One of the design features that was incorporated, although, in architectural terms, Desert Braemar is interesting. The most interesting thing about it, actually, was the fact that he included Bermuda roofs, which were pink. And you can see those here. Some of the homes there still have the Bermuda roofs, but the rest of the community is very historic and beautiful grounds. Robert McCulloch, who I mentioned earlier, also very entrepreneurial and businesslike, and also lots of money, decided that he was going to get in on the act and develop communities too. And so he decided to develop Tierra del Sol. And Tierra del Sol was built along what is now known as Bob Hope Drive. This was Rio del Sol back there. And this community is still there. And it was a community of houses that were mostly all a bit different from each other, laid out around a central swimming pool and clubhouse in the middle. I think there were about 39 houses, and it won an AIA award for site planning for Richard Leach. And Richard Leach was actually a bit like Palmer and Krisel, designing a lot of subdivisions around Southern California. So this, as you can see, was pretty close to Thunderbird, and became popular with people who wanted a single-family home close to the golf course without having the big investment of a big house on the course. This is actually the inside of one of the homes at Tierra del Sol, and I put this up here because I love looking at it. I covet this kitchen like you wouldn't believe. And it's going to be the model for my kitchen in my own 1958 house when I remodel it. But the homes are mostly still there. Some of them have been torn down, and some people are beginning to move into that community and remodel them. And I hope somebody reproduces this kitchen there too. I know some people here from Deval Estates. Deval Estates is actually open to the public on Saturday as part of Modernism Week. I really encourage you to visit if you're not familiar with it. It's on the corner of Frank Sinatra and Deval, and it's 20 cooperative apartments that were built in a kind of star shape, and very unique. Val Palson was an architect who didn't like right angles, and that's very, very expressed in the buildings there. One of the transitions that then started to happen, as I mentioned, is that all these communities started to pop up. So this is Tamarisk Ranchos, where we have our home. Another community here. This was built 58. This was a development called Green Acres that was developed by Gummo Marx's son, Robert Marx. And he also worked on the house that Gummo Marx owned, which was right there. No, is it that one? That one, I think. And you can see that Tamarisk started to develop. So there's more houses being built along streets around here. Down here, actually, you can see you've got the X's of Deval Estate, so you can see how unique those are. This is, by then, a new clubhouse at Tamarisk. And this is Frank Sinatra's estate here. And then you can see Harpo Marx's estate here. And I think this is the Red Skelton house here. You can also see that the land that wasn't built on was starting to be developed, and so the roads have already been planned out here, and you've got more developments around here. And up here is where Sunnylands ends up being. Thunderbird, same kind of thing is going on. Here you've got apartments that are still there. Some really cool apartments up on what's called Thunderbird Terrace. This is Blue Skies Village around here, and then you can see homes being built along the fairways. And those are the Thunderbird cottages that Cody designed. Sunnylands. I'm sure most of you know about Sunnylands. Is there anybody here who doesn't know about Sunnylands? Right, okay, good. Glad you've done your homework. Sunnylands, as I mentioned, is kind of the reason I'm here. And Sunnylands is, I think this is just such an amazing picture, because even though this was built in 1966, you can see what a leap of faith it was for the Annenbergs as well to build their home there, and what a sight that is. So there's Sunnylands, the building itself, right in the middle, and here's the wonderful golf course around it. And the story behind Sunnylands, as you probably know, is that the Annenbergs, so story goes, Walter Annenberg, who was a very keen golfer, wanted to have his own tea times at Tamarisk and Thunderbird, and he was getting frustrated because the courses were so busy. And Scorpy Doyle, who was the caddy over at Tamarisk, apparently joked with him one day, and he was a joker, why don't you build your own golf course? So that's kind of what happened. And to me, Sunnylands epitomizes what Thunderbird and Tamarisk became, because the Annenbergs created a social nexus that also existed at Thunderbird Country Club and at Tamarisk, this amazing mixture of people with lots of money, in their case from publishing newspaper magazines, Walter Annenberg, became US ambassador to the UK, and Lee Annenberg became chief of protocol to Ronald Reagan. And so all these people in politics and celebrity and industry all joined together here in the Valley to create this amazing oasis of influence that I don't think has ever been matched before or since. It's something that, in a sense, it's kind of like the royal family in England. It's just unknown quantity how much influence really existed here. And people just turned up at the Annenbergs' door and enjoyed everything that they had to offer. And as you know, it became very popular subsequently with other presidents, including Obama. So late 60s, now you can really see what's happening. On the left, you've got Thunderbird with all the houses built on the fairways. And you've got Thunderbird Heights up here. This is Thunderbird Villas that they started building in the late 60s. And then over on the right, we've got Tamarisk here. You can see again those X's, love those X's, of Deval Estates. Tamarisk West, the first two circles are there. And then all the other construction going on around here as well. But you still have a lot of empty desert too. So I'm coming to the end, and I just want to take you through some of the pictures of the beautiful houses that exist here in Rancho Mirage that obviously I've included in the book. And although this isn't a plug for the book, I also want you to know that the book includes communities as well as individual houses. So if you live in a community in Rancho Mirage or have any interest in living in one of those resort-style communities, you'll probably find yours in the book. This is the Thomas B. Davis house up in Thunderbird Heights that is stunningly beautiful. This is a house on Thunderbird that was designed for a Texas oilman and then taken over by the Cruttenden family, who've kept it completely original ever since. And it's a stunning house designed by Cody. This is the Kenniston residence, and I can see its owner standing, new owner, I'm happy to say, very happy new owner, standing here today. This is niece Stewart Williams' house. Just a quick funny story that I was telling the owner the other day. I talked to the Kenniston family, the children, about this house, and they remembered it being built. And apparently, remember that house that had the Stewart Williams pool going inside and outside? Well, apparently Stewart Williams wanted to do the same thing at this house. And Bill Kenniston, who was getting the house built, said, "Are you crazy? My children will cause tidal waves every time they jump in and out of the pool." But the children did tell me that they managed to work out a way of climbing up to the top of the rock wall that went all the way down into the pool and throwing themselves off. So you can bet that Bill Kenniston was really glad he didn't have an indoor-outdoor pool. This is the Morantz house, which is one of the most spectacular houses and recognizable to some of you. I'm sure it's on Tamarisk. And it was designed for Leo Morantz, who invented Tasty Freeze. And he wanted the most spectacular house on the golf course. And it was designed for him by Val Palson, who, as I mentioned before, didn't like right angles. And it's a really unique house, and it's also in really fantastic original condition. Very spectacular. It's known to some people as the Gull Wing House. But I prefer its real name, which is a hyperbolic paraboloid, which is always fun to say after a couple of drinks. This is a beautiful Cody house from 1963 on Tamarisk. This is up in Thunderbird Heights, belonged to Brad Dillman and his wife Susie Parker. Brad Dillman was a famous TV star. I think he was in The Fugitive, am I right? And Susie Parker was known as the face of modeling. She was an amazingly beautiful model, and they owned that house for many years. The Hurd residence. This is up in Thunderbird Heights. This is a very famous house by Crombie Taylor, who was actually the architect who really introduced Bauhaus to America. And this is about the only modernist house in the desert, well, it's Bauhaus rather than desert modernist, that doesn't have any overhang. So what we do know is that they didn't spend summers here. But they also had a huge art collection, and this house is absolutely sensational house. Very, very important house in architecture terms. There's a big book about Crombie Taylor's work that came out about 10 years ago, and this house is featured in there. This house is in the process of getting historic designation. It was Cody's last residential commission. And it's a very beautiful house designed in the hacienda style, which the owners insisted on, and they were big art collectors too. There was a big party there, PS ModCom party there on Saturday, and it's in fabulous original condition, and I'm happy to say the new owner is really going to be taking care of it. Sunnylands needs no introduction. And then we get to Maslin House. So we saw a picture of this before, and some of you may know this story, but I think the most important thing to talk about at this point is the fact that that's what it then became. What happened in 2002 was that Maslins had passed away by this time, and the family put the house on the market, and the person who bought the house assured everybody that they were going to keep it the way it was. It was in immaculate, pristine, well-cared-for condition. It didn't have deferred maintenance issues particularly. And the new owner went into the city and got a demolition permit. So that was the end of the Neutra on Tamarisk. And that brings me more or less to the end. In the meantime, while I've been writing a book, I've also been setting up a preservation group in Rancho Mirage. The preservation group is growing, I'm glad to say. There are a lot of people in Rancho Mirage that really appreciate the amazing architectural legacy we have here. And if anyone is interested in finding out more, we have flyers and information just outside the door. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.